Welcome to my channel. If you like it, leave a like and a comment. Enjoy watching. Queen Vealora of Dracarith sat upon her throne of obsidian and steel, her presence alone enough to make even the most battle-hardened generals shift uneasily. Her armor, etched with the blood marks of 100 victories, gleamed under the cold light of the war chamber. Her crown, sharp and jagged like the spires of the burning cliffs, rested lightly on her brow, but her eyes carried the true weight of power. Before her, chained and kneeling, was a man who didn't belong. He wasn't one of the bruised soldiers begging for clemency or the trembling diplomats offering false peace. No, he was human. And Vealora hated humans. They were weak, soft, emotional, unpredictable. Yet this one didn't shake. He knelt with his back straight, his head lowered in forced obedience, but there was no fear in him. Only silence. "Elias," she said, the name sharp on her tongue. She leaned forward, elbows on her armored knees. "Do you know what I do to men who defy me?" He lifted his head slowly, not to challenge, but to meet her eyes, calm and direct. That gaze infuriated her. It was honest, pure, and in a court built on fear and lies, it made her feel naked. "I know what you say you do," he replied quietly. Gasps echoed in the chamber. The guards reached for their weapons. Her adviser took a step back, as if expecting a bolt of wrath from her fingers. But Vealora only smiled, cold and slow. "You've got teeth for a pet," she murmured. "I'm not a pet." That made her rise. She stepped down from the throne, her boots clicking on the polished black floor, stopping just inches from his bowed form. She circled him once, twice, like a predator testing prey. He didn't flinch, not even when she knelt before him and took his chin in her gloved fingers. He allowed it, but his eyes never wavered. "You're in chains," she whispered. "And you're alone," he said. Her grip tightened for half a second. Then she laughed, a short, humorless sound that echoed off the stone walls like a challenge. She stood, letting his face go, and turned sharply back to her throne. "Put him in my private wing," she ordered. "Strip him of rank, of history. No name, no past. Just a body to remind me why I conquered his kind." The guards hesitated. "But," she added, glancing over her shoulder, "if any of you harm him, I'll feed you to the next beasts myself." The silence that followed was thick with confusion and fear. The guards moved swiftly, gripping Elias by the arms. He didn't resist. As they dragged him from the hall, he looked back once, just once, and their eyes met again. She should have felt triumph. But instead, she felt the first crack in her armor. And she hated him for it. The skies of Dracarith burned red the night the Krivax attacked. Lightning tore across the upper atmosphere, thick with the smoke of orbital fire, and the capital trembled beneath the screams of the dying. Queen Vealora had led her armies into the wastelands, confident as ever in her strategy, her blades, her brutal command. She stood at the front, silver armor catching the crackling light, her war staff humming with electric energy as her enemies fell one after another. No general dared take her place. No soldier questioned her wrath. Until the sky opened and the Krivax dropped from above like demons. They were not soldiers. They were assassins in biomech suits, bred for one purpose, to kill royalty. They broke the front line in seconds. Her guards fell in showers of red mist. Her generals vanished in pillars of plasma fire. Vealora fought like a wounded beast, cutting down attackers 2, 3 at a time. But even she couldn't see the blast coming. The plasma strike hit her left shoulder first, disintegrating the armor and searing into bone. She staggered back, gasping, but still standing, until the second blast hit her thigh, knocking her from her feet. She hit the ground hard, metal clanging against stone and dirt. Her fingers clawed the soil, trying to rise. Her leg refused. Her shoulder burned. She tasted blood. Around her, the battlefield was chaos. Her army had scattered. Her banner had fallen. And she was alone. She looked up at the swirling storm of battle, reaching for her weapon with trembling fingers. No one came for her. No elite guard. No loyal commander. Not even her second-in-command. But someone did come. He was unarmed. Unarmored. Filthy from the dust and the ash and the weight of servitude. Elias. He wasn't supposed to be there. He had no role in war, no place on the field. He was a slave. And yet he was running toward her, dodging fire, weaving between broken bodies and shattered war machines. His breath came in ragged bursts, but his eyes were locked on her. She could barely raise her voice. "Leave me," she hissed. He didn't listen. He slid beside her, checking her wounds with a roughness that betrayed urgency but never cruelty. She winced when his hand touched the raw burn at her shoulder. "You'll die here," he said flatly, "unless you let me move you." She clenched her teeth, her pride screaming louder than her pain. "You are nothing. You're not allowed to touch me." He met her eyes. "Then punish me later." Without waiting for permission, he lifted her, awkwardly at first, as she cursed and bit down on a scream. But he held her, cradled her as if she were something precious instead of a queen made of iron and fire. The walk was long. Every step was a gamble against death. Explosions shook the ground. Enemy ships hovered overhead. Scanners searched for survivors to finish off. Still, Elias pressed on, navigating through the smoke with a desperate focus. Her blood soaked through his shirt. Her breathing grew shallow. But she noticed something strange. He wasn't afraid. Not of the enemy. Not of death. Not even of her. That terrified her more than anything else. By the time they reached the ruins of an abandoned outpost, miles from the battlefield, she had passed in and out of consciousness a dozen times. When she came to, she was laid out on cracked stone, her wounds wrapped in old cloth, and Elias was tending a low fire near the wall, rain dripping down from the shattered ceiling. He heard her stir. "You're safe for now," he said. She wanted to scream at him. Demand an explanation. Order him to leave her to die with her dignity. But her voice was weak, and her body refused to move. So instead, her question came out as a whisper. "Why you?" He didn't turn. He just stared into the fire. Because no one else did. The silence stretched between them, heavy with pain and something else she couldn't name. She watched his back, the broad line of his shoulders, the dirt smeared down his neck, and the raw red burns on his forearms from carrying her through fire. And for the first time in her life, she didn't know what to say. The ruined outpost was little more than broken walls and silence. Once a planetary comm station, now it was just another casualty of war, forgotten by all but the dead. The ceiling had collapsed in half the structure, jagged beams forming twisted shadows under the moonlight. Wind howled through shattered vents. Rain came and went in thin sheets. It was the perfect place to disappear. Elias had found a dry corner beneath a slab of collapsed alloy and built a makeshift bed from torn insulation and old military canvas. There he laid Queen Vealora, wrapped her in his own cloak, and watched over her like a soldier guarding sacred ground. Days passed. Her fever worsened before it got better. He crushed old med patches into paste and pressed them into her burns, knowing it wouldn't be enough. She thrashed in her sleep, whispered names he didn't recognize. Blood stained her bandages each time he changed them. Her once flawless face, known throughout the stars for its cruel beauty, was pale, drenched in sweat. Still, she fought. Even when half-conscious, her jaw clenched like a warrior refusing to die. He respected that. He feared it, too. One morning, after 3 sleepless nights, Elias opened his eyes to find her awake, truly awake, glaring at him through slitted, sharp eyes. "You've been watching me sleep," she rasped. He raised an eyebrow. You would have died if I hadn't. She tried to sit up, winced, and fell back with a snarl. You touch me again without permission, and You'll what? He asked quietly. She froze. The silence stretched. The only sound was the crackling of the small fire and the steady drip of rain from a broken pipe above. He leaned forward and picked up a cup of water. She didn't reach for it, not at first. Her pride burned hotter than her wounds. But her hand trembled, and when she tried to lift it herself, it dropped uselessly to her side. He brought the cup to her lips. She drank in silence, refusing to look at him. "Why are you here?" she asked at last. "You know why." "I don't," she snapped. "You should have run. Saved yourself." He didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted to the fire again. "I wasn't raised to leave people behind," he said. She almost laughed. A short, bitter sound. "You're a slave. You don't get raised. You get broken." He looked at her then, really looked. And what she saw in his eyes wasn't pity or anger or fear. It was defiance. Quiet, unshakable defiance. "Maybe you were," he said. "But I wasn't born in chains." She turned her face away, and for the first time since the battlefield, she didn't speak. That night, the fever returned. She shook, muttering things in her sleep, battle cries, old Dracarith war verses, her mother's name. Elias held her when the tremors came, whispered calming words in a language she didn't understand. And when the storm hit, when thunder cracked and wind swept through the broken outpost, Vealora woke gasping, drenched in sweat, eyes wild with pain and confusion. He was already there beside her, one hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. "You're safe," he said. Her fingers found his shirt, clutched it. She didn't thank him. She didn't cry. But she didn't let go either. The days after were slower. Her strength returned in pieces. She could sit up, talk more, curse him with greater variety. But something was shifting between them, slowly, dangerously. He watched her differently now. Not as a queen, not even as a patient, but as a woman he couldn't stop thinking about. And she knew it. One night, when the rain returned and the firelight danced along her healing scars, she spoke without looking at him. "You saved my life." "You needed saving," he said simply. She turned her head toward him. Her voice was low, fragile. "I don't know what to do with that." He didn't move, didn't blink. "You don't have to do anything." But her hand reached out anyway. And this time, he didn't pull away. By the 5th day in the ruins, Queen Vealora could stand. Not well, not gracefully, but enough to plant her feet and glare at the horizon like she planned to conquer it again. Elias watched her rise from the makeshift bed with the stubbornness only royalty could manage. She gritted her teeth as her injured leg fought to hold her weight. Her left arm was wrapped tight in bandages, stiff and useless, but she kept her chin lifted. "Help me walk," she said, almost too quietly to hear. He stepped behind her without a word, slipping his arm gently around her waist, letting her lean against him. She trembled, but not from weakness. From rage. From pride. From something deeper she couldn't name. Every step across the broken floor was a small war. She cursed under her breath. Refused to rest. Elias didn't rush her. He simply moved with her, matching her pace, guiding without pushing. Each time she stumbled, he caught her without letting her fall. And each time, she hated how much she needed that. Later, she sat by the fire, sweat on her brow, eyes closed. Her muscles twitched from exhaustion. Elias knelt a few feet away, working silently on a pile of salvaged metal and scorched tech parts. "What are you doing?" she asked, voice rasping. "Fixing something," he replied. He didn't explain further. She watched him for a while. His hands moved quickly, confidently. He was no soldier, yet his fingers had the precision of an engineer, or maybe something more. The pieces he handled were fragments of broken exosuits and ruined weaponry scavenged from the battlefield. "I thought you were just a servant," she said after a long silence. "I was a mechanic. Before your war," he answered. She looked away, unsettled by the honesty in his tone, as if it was just a fact, not an accusation. By nightfall, Elias held up the finished piece, a makeshift brace. Thick, adjustable, forged from battle scrap and rewired power cores. Ugly, but strong. He stepped toward her, holding it like an offering. "For your leg," he said. "It'll hold you up while it heals." She stared at it without moving. "I don't need help walking." "No," he replied. "But you need help fighting." That silenced her. She took it slowly, ran her fingers over the reinforced joints. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't royal. But it was built for survival. She didn't say thank you. She just strapped it on and stood. The support changed everything. She moved better, surer, stronger. She still leaned on him, but less. Each step felt less like defeat. That night, something shifted between them. Elias sat by the fire, lost in thought. She approached silently, dropped beside him, closer than usual. Close enough for her knee to brush his. He didn't move. "You're not like the others," she murmured. He turned to her. "The others. The ones who fear me. Who obey me because they're afraid of what I'll do if they don't." He held her gaze. There was no fear in him. There never had been. "I don't obey you," he said. "I choose to help you." She looked away quickly, as if his words burned more than her wounds. "Why?" she whispered. "Why me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached toward her slowly, cautiously, his fingers brushing the side of her face. She flinched, not from fear, but from unfamiliarity. "You're not the queen out here," he said. "You're just a woman trying to survive." She closed her eyes at his touch. It was gentle, real. When she opened them, she saw something in him that terrified her more than any weapon, any battle. Affection. Genuine, impossible affection. He leaned in. She didn't stop him. His lips met hers, soft, hesitant, honest. There was no power in the kiss. No conquest. Just connection. Heat. Humanity. And she kissed him back. It wasn't passion that drove it. Not yet. It was something far more dangerous. Need. When it ended, they didn't speak. They just sat together, breathing the same air, the fire crackling between them, their hands finding each other in the quiet. The queen didn't feel broken anymore. She felt something she hadn't in years. Alive. Smoke still hung over the horizon, thick and black like the breath of a dying god. Vealora stood at the edge of the ridge, her damaged leg braced, her left arm still bound in layers of synth bandage, her hair tangled by wind and battle ash. She wore no crown now, only a scorched cloak, patched armor, and the resolve of someone with nothing left to lose. Elias stood behind her, adjusting the belt of weapons he'd scavenged from the corpses left in the Kryvak's ambush. The battered rifle slung over his shoulder wasn't military grade, but in his hands it looked reliable. Purposeful. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice quiet beneath the wind. Vealora didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the dark silhouette of Dracarith Citadel in the distance. Once her home. Now a nest of traitors. "If I don't return," she said, "they'll rewrite everything. They'll say I fled, died a coward. My name will rot before my bones." "And if you do return?" he asked. She turned to him then, a slow, dangerous smile on her lips. "Then I'll remind them what happens to those who try to kill a queen." Elias didn't smile. but his gaze lingered on her longer than it should have. There was steel in her now, something reborn from the fire. She was still wounded, still slower than before, but she was awake. Alive. A storm waiting to be unleashed. They traveled by night, skirting burned roads and twisted wreckage. The skies were still patrolled, but the Krivax had moved on, satisfied with their damage. The real enemy waited behind the palace walls. General Care, her former advisor, the one who had declared her dead and claimed the throne within hours of the ambush. He had always bowed too low, spoken too smoothly. Vealora had trusted him once. That mistake would be corrected soon. At dawn, they reached the lower ruins of the capital. The outer walls had collapsed in the first wave of strikes. The once proud statues of Dracarith warriors lay shattered in the streets, their faces buried in dust. It had been 5 days, and already her banners were gone, replaced with the serpent sigil of Care's loyalists. They moved silently through alleyways, avoiding patrols. Elias led them into the catacombs beneath the war chambers. Through a hidden passage he had overheard nobles whispering about during his time in the palace. Vealora didn't speak much. Her breath was steady, but her fingers flexed constantly, as if longing for a sword. When they reached the lift chamber deep underground, the silence between them cracked. "Once we go up, it won't stop until it's finished," Elias said, checking the power cell of his rifle. "We can still leave. Vanish. Let them burn each other." Vealora stepped close, her hand lifting to brush a strand of dust from his jaw. He looked at her, not as a slave, not as a protector, but as something more. "Everything I've built," she said softly, "is ashes. Except you." He didn't respond, not with words. He kissed her again. There was no hesitation this time. No guilt. Just heat. Urgency. Her fingers gripped the back of his neck. His arms wrapped around her waist, careful of her injuries. In that moment, they weren't queen and slave. They were two people at the edge of war, clinging to the only truth they had left. When the kiss ended, she rested her forehead against his. "Stay close to me," she whispered. "Always," he said. The lift rose. When the doors opened into the heart of the throne chamber, all hell broke loose. Gasps. Shouts. Blades drawn. Care turned from the high seat he had stolen, his smug expression shattering the instant he saw her. "You're supposed to be dead," he choked. Vealora stepped forward, limping, her eyes lit with fury and fire. "You should have made sure." Elias moved beside her, rifle up. She drew her sword with her one working hand, the blade still scorched from the battlefield. The nobles fled. The guards hesitated. And then the fighting began. It wasn't a battle. It was a reckoning. Elias moved with precision, cutting down soldiers who underestimated him. Vealora, wounded but unstoppable, fought like she was born in that chamber, her sword carving through armor and betrayal alike. Blood slicked the marble floors. Screams echoed through the golden dome. Care tried to run. She didn't let him. She caught him at the steps of the throne and drove her sword through his chest without a word. He died with her name on his lips, not in praise, but in disbelief. When the chamber finally went quiet, Vealora stood over the throne, broken, bloodied, breathless. Her crown lay at her feet, kicked aside in the chaos. Elias stepped toward her, his armor torn, his knuckles bruised, his eyes never leaving her face. She turned to him slowly, chest rising and falling. And for the first time in her reign, she didn't sit alone. She reached out her hand. He took it. Together, they stepped toward the throne. The palace of Dracarith was silent in the days after the throne was reclaimed. The fires had been extinguished, the bodies buried, and the banners raised once again. But something had changed, something deeper than stone and steel. Queen Vealora did not immediately sit upon the throne. She walked the halls first, slowly, remembering every step. Every corridor felt different now. Smaller. Emptier. Not because they had changed, but because she had. Her wounds were healing. The brace still supported her leg, and her left arm was only just beginning to regain motion. She bore every scar with pride. They reminded her not of weakness, but of survival. Of Elias. Of everything she nearly lost. Outside the war chamber, nobles and generals waited nervously for her first decree. Whispers spread about the man who had walked beside her through blood and ruin. A human slave, now her shadow. Her shield. Her choice. Inside the chamber, Elias stood by the window, the city stretching out below in golden sunrise. He wore cleaner armor now, though it didn't quite fit. He had refused the silks and jewels the attendants offered. He turned when she entered, his eyes instantly softening. She walked straight to him and took his hand without hesitation. "They're waiting," he said. "They can wait a little longer," she replied. He looked at her for a long moment, as if still trying to understand how the most feared queen in the galaxy could look at him the way she did. "You don't have to keep me," he said quietly. She blinked once. "I'm not keeping you. Then what am I?" She didn't answer with words. She leaned in and kissed him, not out of desperation, not from pain or fear, but from love. Simple, strong, quiet love. When she pulled back, her hand cupped his cheek. "You're not mine by chains," she said. "You're mine by choice. And I am yours." A pause. Then, softly, she added, "If you'll have me." Elias's breath caught. "I already do." When they stepped out into the grand hall together, the nobles fell silent. The sight of them, her in royal armor, him at her side, was a vision no one had dared imagine, not even in the wildest rumors. She raised her voice, strong and steady. "I do not rule alone," she declared. "The war nearly took everything from me. But one man brought me back. Not because he had to. Not because I ordered it. But because he believed I was worth saving." Gasps. Murmurs. No one dared interrupt. She looked at Elias. "In a time when every crown felt like a curse, he reminded me what it meant to be human." Then she turned back to the assembly. "This throne is mine by blood. But my future is ours." Her hand reached for Elias's. And before the court of Dracarith, she placed the royal crest upon his palm. Not as a servant. Not as a consort. But as her equal. They sat together on the throne that once felt cold and lifeless. Now it was warm beneath them. Alive. Real. In the months that followed, Dracarith changed. War softened into peace. Old enemies came forward seeking truce, no longer from fear, but respect. The people no longer whispered about the queen who ruled with fire, but of the woman who walked through fire and came back with a heart no longer hidden beneath armor. And every time Vealora looked at Elias, whether in council or at night beneath starlit windows, she remembered what it cost to find him, and why she would never let him go.